Good afternoon, friends. Today we will delve into one of the most intriguing and little-known topics in history: how people coped with the cold and slept in the icy English medieval world. We tend to think of the Middle Ages as a time of harsh castles and simple peasant huts, but we rarely consider what happened when night fell and a blizzard raged outside. We will talk about how kings and commoners made their beds, what technologies were used for heating, and how even the richest people could not afford what is considered everyday comfort today. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how just one item could save you from the cold and how many times a night people got up to keep from freezing. Before the invention of electric blankets, people used a very simple but effective method. Bottles filled with hot water. These could be ceramic vessels, or even copper ones in wealthier homes. They were filled with hot water, tightly closed, and placed under the blanket. The heat from such a hot water bottle lasted for several hours, allowing people to warm their feet and fall asleep in relative comfort. If there was no water, stones heated on the fire could be used, but this method was more dangerous, as the stones could be too hot and cause burns. The use of such primitive but effective methods of heating beds was a necessity, not a luxury. Most houses, even those of the nobility, did not have central heating, and the fireplaces and hearths used for heating could only keep the immediate vicinity of the fire warm. A few hours after the hearth died down, the temperature in the room dropped to the outside level, and sometimes even lower, as the stone walls did not retain heat, but on the contrary, accumulated cold. Therefore, warming the bed became a critically important part of preparing for sleep. Ceramic and copper vessels filled with hot water or hot coals were among the most common methods, but they were far from the only ones. Ordinary people who did not have such vessels could use hot bricks wrapped in thick cloth, or even just hot ashes poured into a clay pot. Such methods were more risky due to the danger of fire or burns, but in the harsh winter conditions, people were willing to take such risks for the sake of warmth. Heated objects were placed at the foot of the bed, where they helped to warm the limbs, which are most vulnerable to the cold. In wealthy homes, there was even a special position called a bed warmer. This was a servant whose job was to warm the master's bed before bedtime. Special tools similar to frying pans with long handles were used for this purpose, into which hot coals were placed. They were passed over the entire surface of the bed to warm the blankets and mattress. This ritual was not only a matter of comfort, but also part of the daily routine of the aristocracy, demonstrating their status. In addition, people used a natural method of warming up by gathering together. In peasant huts and craftsmen's houses, the whole family often slept in one bed or on a pile of straw. The warmth of human bodies close together was the most reliable and accessible source of heat. This method was especially effective for those who did not have access to artificial heaters. In the cold, there was no room for personal space, and survival was more important. This dependence on simple means of heating explains why people in those days often woke up in the middle of the night. If the fire in the hearth went out and the warmth from the hot water bottle disappeared, the cold penetrated to the bones. Waking up to throw wood on the fire was a normal part of nighttime life. It was a constant cycle of fighting the cold that interrupted sleep and required constant attention. All these techniques, from simple ceramic bottles to complex rituals in castles, show how serious the problem of cold was in the medieval English world. People's ingenuity and adaptability allowed them to survive and even find ways to make their lives a little more comfortable. Have you ever used any unusual methods to keep warm? Tell us about the strangest method you've tried in the comments.
It's getting colder tonight.
In the Middle Ages, a bed was not just a piece of furniture. For many, it was the most valuable item in the house. But the beds we are used to seeing in movies were the exception rather than the rule. The simplest people, peasants and craftsmen, often slept on the floor, on mattresses stuffed with straw or dry leaves. Of course, this way of sleeping did not provide adequate comfort and warmth, but it was the only option available. Straw, which was changed every few weeks, was a simple but effective insulator. Imagine coming home after a hard day's work and falling onto a pile of straw, covering yourself with an old woolen cloak. This is not what we would call a good night's sleep today. For a medieval peasant, sleeping on straw was not just a necessity, but part of a harsh way of life. Straw mattresses were cheap to make, but quickly became unusable due to moisture and dust. They had to be taken outside regularly to dry. This was one of the most routine but necessary household chores. In the cold season, such a mattress quickly became damp and lost its insulating properties. But despite this, straw was easily accessible and could be replaced at any time. In addition to straw, bags filled with dry leaves, moss, or even low-quality wool could be used as mattresses. These materials also provided some insulation from the cold ground, but were much less comfortable than straw. Often, the entire family would sleep together on one large bed to keep warm. This not only helped maintain the temperature, but also served as a social ritual, strengthening family ties. In the cramped and cold conditions, people found comfort and a sense of security. The location in the house where people slept was also important. People tried to sleep as close to the hearth or stove as possible, as this was the only source of heat in the house. Sleeping by the hearth was a privilege that not everyone could afford. Often, the head of the household slept closer to the heat, while the rest slept further away. Sleeping on the floor was risky, as it was exposed to drafts. To minimize their impact, people slept in groups, forming a kind of living blanket. Despite its apparent primitiveness, this way of sleeping was part of a whole survival system. People could not afford to waste resources on luxuries. Everything at their disposal served practical purposes: food to survive, clothing to keep warm, and a place to sleep to regain strength for the new day. Sleeping on straw was not just the norm, but one of the symbols of a hard life in which every day was a struggle for existence. It was a world where comfort was secondary and survival was paramount. Thus, the simplest household item, a place to sleep, could tell a lot. It spoke of social status, wealth, standard of living, and even how close the family was to each other. That is why the bed was not just a piece of furniture, but a symbol. But what if your bed was not just a place to sleep, but a symbol of your power and wealth? How did your approach to sleep change if you were not just a peasant, but a nobleman? Let's find out. Social status was reflected in everything, including where people slept. In the homes of wealthy people, the bed was not just a place to rest, but the centerpiece of the bedroom, often elevated on a platform. This piece of furniture was massive, with carved wooden posts and decorations, and most importantly, a canopy. The canopy, with thick curtains made of wool, silk, or velvet, served not only as decoration, but also as a functional element. It created an isolated cocoon that helped retain the heat emanating from the sleeping person and protected against drafts blowing through the large, cold halls of castles and manors. Mattresses for the nobility were stuffed with feathers or down, which made them soft and good at keeping in heat. This was a huge contrast to the straw and leaves that most people slept on. Bedding, if available, was made of linen, and blankets were warm, often made of several layers of wool or even fur. The wealthy had their own ways of warming their beds. They used special hot water bottles filled with hot coals or boiling water, which were placed under the blanket before bedtime. However, despite all the luxury and precautions, it was very cold in castles and stone houses. Huge fireplaces, which could only heat a small part of the hall, could not cope with heating the entire room, and the heat quickly dissipated. Even in rooms with fireplaces, the temperature could be only a few degrees higher than outside. Therefore, even wealthy people slept covered with many blankets and often in warm nightgowns. This was far from the modern idea of comfort. Thus, even in the wealthiest homes and castles, where beds were a symbol of status and luxury, people still faced the same problem: the cold. Their measures were more sophisticated, but they did not always provide complete comfort. They only helped to make the night a little less harsh. The bed, as a symbol of status, was often the most expensive piece of furniture in the house and was passed down from generation to generation. It was made by the best carpenters and decorated with carvings and inlays. In addition to the canopy, which served a practical purpose, the bed could be richly decorated with velvet, silk, or brocade, emphasizing the high status of the owner. People slept on such beds not only for comfort, but also to demonstrate their wealth. In addition to beds, portable braziers were often used in the bedrooms of the nobility, which were placed next to the bed to keep it warm. These were metal vessels filled with hot coals that provided heat and light. However, they were dangerous due to the risk of fire and could emit carbon monoxide, so their use required great caution. The main problem with castles and large houses was that their stone walls, although they protected against the wind, also accumulated cold. A fireplace in a huge hall could only heat a small part of the room, and the heat did not linger due to the high ceilings and large windows. In such conditions, even the most luxurious four-poster bed was more of a refuge from the cold than just a place to sleep. Sleeping in a castle was a multi-step process. First, the servants warmed the bed, then covered it with several layers of blankets and covers, and the owner himself went to bed dressed in a warm nightshirt, sometimes even with a cap on his head to keep his ears warm. This was far from the modern idea of a comfortable night's sleep. Thus, even in the wealthiest homes and castles, cold remained a serious problem. A luxurious bed was merely an attempt to create the illusion of comfort in a world where warmth was a rare and valuable resource. It symbolized the status of its owner, but could not completely protect him from the harsh reality of the medieval winter. Most medieval houses did not have separate bedrooms. The whole family slept in one large room, and sometimes in the same room as the servants. This helped to conserve heat and made it easier to heat the room. Everyone gathered around the fireplace or hearth to warm up before going to bed. Sleeping in the same room with relatives and sometimes with strangers was commonplace. It was not only a matter of comfort, but also of safety. Burning coals or candles could cause a fire, and sleeping together made it easier to spot danger. Moreover, the warmth of human bodies close together also helped to keep everyone warm. People went to bed in the same clothes they wore during the day, and some simply wrapped themselves in their cloaks. Sleeping in the same room with relatives was not only a practical measure to combat the cold, but also an important element of medieval culture. It strengthened family ties and created a sense of community. In large houses and castles, where both the owners and servants slept, this was the norm. This arrangement also allowed noble people to always be protected by their servants, who slept at the doors. Sleeping together was a kind of protective system that helped to cope not only with the cold, but also with other dangers that could arise at night. In huts and simple houses without fireplaces, the only source of heat was the hearth. Before going to bed, people closed the doors and windows tightly to keep as much heat as possible inside, and gathered around the hearth to warm up before going to sleep. People often slept in the same clothes they worked in during the day. Woolen linen clothing was the main source of warmth and was only taken off in extreme cases. In winter, sleep became a real challenge. The cold penetrated the walls and floors, and the air in the room grew colder by the minute. Therefore, people slept huddled together to share their body heat. This was necessary for survival. In some houses, people even built beds on raised platforms to sleep further away from the cold floor and drafts. Nighttime breaks to tend the fire were common. If there was a hearth in the house, one of the household members or servants had to get up in the middle of the night to throw wood on the fire. This was necessary to keep the heat up and prevent everyone from freezing. Such night work was part of everyday life and was taken for granted. For noble people, tending the fire at night was the duty of the servants. They stood guard to keep the fires burning in the fireplaces and bring their masters warm drinks. This was one of many rituals that ensured comfort and safety at night. In general, the family bedroom in the medieval world was not only a place to sleep, but also the center of life. It was a place where people shared warmth, communicated, and helped each other survive in harsh conditions. It was an important part of their culture, which taught them cooperation and mutual assistance. But what if, in the middle of the night, you realize that the fire's almost out and everything around you is starting to freeze? How did medieval people solve this problem, and why did some have to get out of bed several times a night, risking freezing on the way? We'll tell you more about that later. The night was full of dangers. One of them was the cold. If the hearth went out and the coals cooled down, the temperature in the room dropped quickly. To avoid freezing, people, and sometimes specially assigned servants, had to get up several times a night to throw wood on the fire and keep it burning. It was hard work. The nightly trek from bed to the hearth in a freezing room, wearing only a nightshirt, could be a real ordeal. This also explains why many people preferred to sleep fully clothed. It was easier to get up at night and not be afraid of the cold. Nighttime duties for keeping the fire going were unevenly distributed. In wealthy homes and castles, it was the responsibility of the servants. They worked in shifts so that one of them could always wake up and add wood to the fire. This work was hard, as the servants had to sleep in cold rooms, often on the floor, to be ready to act. They were also responsible for making sure the fire didn't cause a fire, which was super important since many houses were made of wood and straw. In peasant households, this duty was shared by all members of the family. The person who slept closest to the hearth was the night watchman, who had to keep an eye on the coals and add wood when necessary. This work required light sleep and a readiness to get up at any moment to prevent the fire from going out. Nighttime trips to the hearth were not only physically demanding, but also mentally exhausting. The cold air, drafts, and darkness made this process particularly unpleasant. To make this task easier, people resorted to various tricks. For example, they tried to place large logs in the hearth before going to bed so that they would smolder longer. They could also use special clay pots in which the coals were kept until morning. These vessels were called night pots and were a kind of primitive thermos. They allowed the smoldering coals to be preserved so that it would be easier to light a fire in the morning. In addition, people used nightcaps and thick socks to protect their heads and feet from the cold. These simple items of clothing helped to retain heat and made nighttime trips to the hearth less painful. All this suggests that people did not simply endure the cold, but actively fought against it using all the means at their disposal. Night in the medieval world was a time when the line between life and death became particularly thin. The cold could be as dangerous as wild animals. Therefore, the struggle for warmth was constant and relentless. It was not just a matter of comfort, but a matter of survival. Thus, nighttime breaks from the fire were an integral part of life in medieval England. They were necessary for survival and required great strength of spirit and endurance from people. This routine, which seems strange to us today, was an everyday reality for them. In conditions where every source of heat was worth its weight in gold, people also actively used the warmth of animals. In some houses, livestock, especially large animals, were kept in the same room as people, but behind a special partition. The heat from the animals helped to maintain a higher temperature in the room. This method was particularly common in poor peasant homes. Another method was to use ashes and cinders. After the fire in the hearth had died down, people would pour hot ashes into small bags and place them under their blankets. The ashes retained heat for a long time and helped to warm the bed. Of course, this was risky, as a spark could cause a fire, but in cold conditions, people were willing to take such risks. These simple but effective methods were part of their daily struggle for survival. Finally, it is important to mention that fighting the cold was part of the collective experience. People helped each other, shared firewood and advice on how best to stay warm. It was a time when mutual aid and community were vital. The cold not only divided people, but also united them in their desire to survive. Nightwear in the Middle Ages was extremely simple. Men and women slept in long linen or woolen shirts. These shirts were loose and did not restrict movement, and the thick fabric protected against drafts. During the cold season, several layers of such clothing were worn at night. Those who could not afford this slept in the same clothes they wore during the day. It was believed that the body should breathe, so wrapping oneself up completely was considered harmful. But when it was below freezing outside and barely above freezing inside, these rules were often broken. Sleeping in daytime clothes, although common among the poor, had its drawbacks. Daytime clothes, especially those made of coarse wool, could be stiff and rub the skin, and over time they became dirty. Therefore, nightshirts, even the simplest ones, were an important part of everyday life. They were specially tailored for sleeping, looser and more comfortable. For people who did heavy physical labor all day, such clothing was the only way to give their bodies a rest. Shirts were made of linen, which was softer than wool but also provided a certain level of warmth. An important part of the nighttime wardrobe were nightcaps and socks. They helped keep the head and feet warm, which are most vulnerable to the cold. Nightcaps were especially popular because they protected against drafts and prevented the head from getting cold. They were made of wool or thick linen and worn by both men and women. Wool socks were an essential part of winter sleepwear, as the cold floor could quickly chill the feet, making it difficult to fall asleep. In addition to clothing, people used extra layers to keep warm. These could be woolen cloaks or blankets that were worn over nightgowns. On particularly cold nights, people would even sleep in their cloaks to keep the heat in. This layering was key to survival in conditions where there was no heating. It was believed that the body should not be too hot during sleep to prevent sweating, which would evaporate and cool the body. Therefore, people tried to find a balance between sufficient warmth and allowing the body to breathe. However, in severe frost, these rules took a back seat, and the main goal was simply not to freeze. People wrapped themselves in blankets and fabrics so tightly that they sometimes resembled cocoons. This struggle for warmth at night was an integral part of everyday life. Sleepwear was not just an item of clothing, but an important tool for survival. It helped people withstand low temperatures and regain their strength for a new working day. It was a world where comfort was a luxury and warmth was a necessity. Thus, medieval sleepwear was simple but functional. It served its main purpose, to protect against the cold and provide a minimum level of comfort. This simplicity at first glance was dictated by poverty, but in fact was the result of centuries of experience and adaptation to harsh conditions. We are used to falling asleep on a soft pillow, but how about putting a bag filled with straw under your head? And what if that wasn't even the worst option? Let's talk about it in more detail. Pillows were another luxury item. Ordinary people slept without them or used rolled-up clothes or sacks filled with straw instead. These pillows were hard and uncomfortable, but they were better than nothing. In the homes of wealthy people, pillows were stuffed with feathers and down, which made them soft and comfortable. But even then, they were a rarity. For most medieval people, a pillow was not just an element of comfort, but a symbol of social inequality. Its absence was the norm, to which they had been accustomed since childhood. Rolled-up clothes or bags of straw were the only option for supporting the head. Such improvised pillows were not only hard, but also quickly lost their shape, which led to an uncomfortable sleeping position. Straw, as in the case of mattresses, quickly became matted and required regular replacement. As an alternative to straw, hay, dry leaves, moss, or even low-quality wool could be used. These materials were readily available and inexpensive, but they did not provide adequate comfort. People often slept with their hands under their heads, or simply resting their heads on their neighbor's shoulders if they were sleeping in cramped conditions. This was part of their everyday life, and they did not perceive it as a deprivation. For nobles and wealthy townspeople, pillows were a luxury item that emphasized their status. These pillows were true works of art. They were sewn from expensive fabrics, such as silk or velvet, and decorated with embroidery or gold thread. They were stuffed with goose or swan feathers, which made them incredibly soft and comfortable. Having such a pillow was a sign of wealth and high social status. In wealthy homes, pillows could be of various sizes and shapes. Some were small and intended for sleeping, while others were large and served to support the back while sitting. They were an important element of the interior and were often displayed for guests to admire the wealth of the owner. However, even these luxurious pillows could not completely solve the problem of cold. They provided comfort, but did not protect against drafts and low temperatures. Despite all the differences in comfort, sleep in the medieval world was primarily functional. Its main purpose was to restore strength for the new day. And regardless of whether you slept on straw or a feather bed, this goal remained the same. For most people, the lack of pillows was not a tragedy, but rather an everyday reality. They learned to sleep in any conditions, which speaks to their incredible endurance and ability to adapt to the harsh world in which they lived. Thus, the pillow was not just an item for sleeping, but a symbol that divided the society into rich and poor. It reflected the standard of living and comfort that a person could afford. But ultimately, all people, regardless of their status, face the same problem: how to survive in the cold. And the lack of a pillow was just one of the many difficulties they had to cope with. With the onset of cold weather, life changed. In winter, people went to bed earlier to save candles and got up later, when it was already light. People spent long nights in one room doing needlework, telling stories, or just chatting. It was a time when families and neighbors could spend more time together, which brought them closer. The winter daily routine was determined not only by the cold, but also by economic realities. Candles made from lard or beeswax were an expensive luxury. Wealthy families could afford to light their homes in the evenings, but for most people, this was an unaffordable luxury. Therefore, when darkness fell, people tried to finish all their chores and go to bed. This saved not only candles, but also firewood, as the human body consumes less energy when asleep and can tolerate lower temperatures. The long winter nights became a time for social interaction and learning. When work in the fields stopped and it was too cold to do anything outside, people gathered together. In peasant huts and workshops, craftsmen passed on their knowledge to their apprentices. They learned to sew, weave, repair tools, and create new things. This process was an important part of life, as it ensured the continuity of crafts. Young people gained not only knowledge but also the wisdom of their elders, who passed on their life experience through stories and fairy tales. Winter was a time for repairs and preparations. Clothes and shoes that had worn out during fieldwork needed to be repaired. Men repaired tools, wove baskets, and did carpentry work that did not require much space. Women spun wool, sewed clothes, and prepared food. These tasks were no less important than summer work, as they determined survival for the following year. In addition to household chores, winter evenings were a time for entertainment. People gathered together to sing songs, tell stories, and play simple games. This was a way to cope with the monotony and cold. Stories about heroes and fairy tale creatures were passed down by word of mouth and were part of the cultural heritage. Laughter and communication helped people forget their hardships and keep their spirits up. In the homes of the nobility and aristocracy, winter evenings were also a time for gatherings. Fireplaces were lit in large halls, and people gathered to dine, listen to music, or play board games. It was a time when knights and ladies could socialize, which was impossible during the busy summer months. Winter was a kind of holiday season from military campaigns and tournaments. Thus, winter in the medieval English world was not just a time of inactivity, but an important period in the annual cycle. It forced people to adapt, be more resourceful, and find new ways to use their time. The long nights, which we today perceive as a disadvantage, were an opportunity for them to socialize, learn, and prepare for the new season. It was a world where life moved in rhythm with nature, and people learned to respect and use that rhythm. The winter daily routine was a kind of challenge that people responded to with dignity and ingenuity. They didn't just survive, they found ways to live a full life, even in the harshest conditions. Cold, dampness, and poor hygiene were the cause of many diseases. The nighttime cold exacerbated colds and joint pain. Sleeping in cramped quarters was also detrimental to health. But despite all the difficulties, people survived. Their bodies were adapted to the harsh conditions, and their endurance helped them cope with the cold and discomfort. During the winter, respiratory diseases were a particularly acute problem on construction sites and in villages. Constant inhalation of cold, damp air and smoke from fires and hearths led to frequent colds, coughs, and pneumonia. The lack of modern medicines and primitive medical care made these diseases very dangerous. People relied on folk remedies such as herbal decoctions, infusions, and warming to alleviate their condition. However, these methods were not always effective, and many did not survive the harsh conditions. Another serious problem was frostbite. Working outdoors, especially with wet hands or feet, could lead to frostbite, which in severe cases resulted in the loss of limbs. Workers used special leather or wool gloves and shoes, but these did not always protect them from the bitter cold. The lack of a change of clothes and the inability to dry their shoes exacerbated the situation. People were forced to endure pain and discomfort, which affected their productivity and general condition. The cramped conditions in the rooms where people slept together contributed to the spread of infections. Any disease that entered such a closed space could quickly infect everyone nearby. This was especially dangerous for weakened people who were already vulnerable due to the cold and lack of food. Even a common cold could have serious consequences. Despite all these dangers, people survived thanks to their incredible endurance and adaptability. They had been accustomed to harsh conditions since childhood, and their bodies were more resistant to the cold than ours. They learned to sleep in uncomfortable positions, put up with discomfort, and ignore minor ailments. Their bodies were in survival mode, and every calorie went toward maintaining warmth and energy. Diet also played a significant role. The food was simple but very high in calories. Bread, cheese, dried meat, lard, beans, and beer all helped to maintain strength and provided energy to fight the cold. Lard was especially important because it contained a lot of fat, which helped the body generate heat. It was a kind of natural fuel without which survival in harsh conditions would have been impossible. Thus, medieval winters were not only a physical but also a medical challenge. The cold and dampness affected people's health, making them vulnerable to disease. However, thanks to their endurance, adaptability, and simple but high-calorie diet, they coped with these difficulties and continued to live. Their ability to survive in such conditions shows how strong and resilient people were in that era. Even the largest and richest castles were cold. Stone walls did not retain heat, and huge windows let in drafts. To keep warm, people slept in rooms with fireplaces. The fireplaces were huge, but they could only heat a small part of the room. Sometimes fireplaces were located directly in bedrooms. Contrary to our expectations, life in a medieval castle was far from comfortable. Stone walls, although providing reliable protection, were poor insulators. They accumulated cold from the ground and the air and transferred it inside the rooms. Huge windows, which at that time had no glass but were covered with oiled cloth or animal bladders, let in drafts. All this created an atmosphere of eternal cold in the castles, which chilled you to the bone. To keep warm, people used fireplaces. They were huge and required enormous amounts of firewood. But despite their size, they could only heat a small part of the room, and the rest of the space remained cold. The heat from the fireplace rose upward, while the cold air accumulated below, creating constant drafts. To combat this, people often slept in rooms with fireplaces, but even this did not guarantee a warm night. In addition to fireplaces, tapestries were often used in the bedrooms of the nobility. They were hung on the walls to create an extra layer of insulation and protect against drafts. Tapestries were not only a beautiful decorative element, but also functional. They helped to retain heat and made the room more comfortable. The floors in bedrooms were covered with thick carpets and animal skins to prevent heat loss. The bed in a castle was not only a place to sleep, but also a kind of fortress within a fortress. It was surrounded by thick wool or velvet curtains that helped create a cocoon and retain heat. Inside this cocoon, people could maintain a temperature several degrees higher than in the rest of the room. Not only the owners slept in such a fortress, but also their closest servants, who were always nearby to bring hot drinks or throw wood on the fire if necessary. For additional warmth, hot coals and metal braziers were used in the beds. They were placed under the bed or in the bed itself to warm the feet and body. This method was effective but had its risks, as it could lead to fire or carbon monoxide poisoning. Therefore, such braziers were used with great caution and were never left unattended. Sleeping in a castle was a multi-step process. First, servants warmed the bed, then covered it with several layers of blankets and covers, and the owner himself went to bed wearing a warm nightshirt, sometimes even with a cap on his head to keep his ears warm. This was far from the modern idea of a comfortable night's sleep. Thus, even in the richest and most powerful castles, cold was a constant companion. Luxury and wealth could not completely solve the problem of cold. This proves once again that human ingenuity and adaptability were more important than material goods. People learned to live in harmony with nature and use its resources to survive in the harshest conditions. Ultimately, the medieval castle was not only a symbol of power, but also a monument to human perseverance. Its inhabitants, despite all the difficulties, found ways to make their lives more comfortable and survive in a world where heat was the most valuable resource. So, friends, this is how medieval people coped with the cold while sleeping. Their lives were full of hardship, but they learned to adapt, using all available resources, from straw mattresses to hot coals. Their methods, which may seem primitive today, were the result of centuries of experience and a deep understanding of their environment. This ability to survive in harsh conditions, find warmth in the intimacy and comfort of family, and use the simplest items for heating proves once again that human ingenuity knows no bounds. They lived in harmony with nature rather than trying to conquer it, and that is what allowed them to survive. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.